Immediately stakes a claim in the center, preparing to deploy pieces for an active game. Instantly claiming central presence, the knight prepares to contest the d4 pawn and opens avenues for bishop development. Developing a knight to f3 supports a central pawn advance and prepares for kingside castling, generally creating solid foundations. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers a flexible pawn structure, though it immediately concedes central space. Asserting central dominion, c4 now squarely challenges black's queenside pawn structure and aims to seize greater board territory. Solidifying the queen's pawn and preparing to develop the bishop to a strong diagonal, this move anchors black's position. Initiating fianchetto, this prepares a robust kingside defense and potential pressure on the long diagonal. Developing the bishop to this square strategically prepares to challenge white's central pawns and potentially open the a8h1 diagonal for future pressure. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal solidifies control over the center and prepares kingside castling for an imminent clash. Boldly contesting the center, black aims to activate their bishop and fight for central squares, disrupting white's intended queenside pressure. A bold centralization of the knight, aiming to disrupt black's fianchetto and create immediate attacking prospects. Challenging the knight directly, this move forces white to decide whether to trade or retreat, potentially disrupting their intended knight maneuver and creating immediate tactical possibilities for black. Refocusing the attack, white strengthens the center's control and prepares for future pawn advances by activating the bishop. Exchanging the bishop opens a diagonal for black's queen and loosens white's kingside pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the d-file for white's rook and prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure. Securing the king's safety with castling is a fundamental priority, allowing pieces to develop more freely. Establishing dominance over the critical c-file prevents black's queenside expansion. Developing the knight to d7 supports the central pawn push and prepares for piece maneuvering, strengthening black's central control. Unlocking the c-file for potential rook pressure. Regaining the pawn with the queen repositions a key piece, opening the queen's diagonal and preparing for potential central pawn pushes while connecting the rooks. Pushing the c-pawn boldly expands white's queenside pawns, aiming to secure more space and restrict black's piece mobility. Activating the queen, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and contest central space, subtly probing for weaknesses. Unleashing queenside pressure, white aims to exploit black's somewhat passive development and potential pawn weaknesses. Shifting the queen to the queenside creates active counterplay on the c-file, eyeing potential weaknesses. Pressuring black's queenside structure, this aims to exploit the weak b6 pawn and disrupt their development. Grabbing that pawn recklessly exposes your queen to a dangerous counterattack, potentially jeopardizing piece coordination. Crushing black's queenside pawn structure like this creates a lasting weakness and seizes control of vital squares. Reclaiming the pawn on c6 is a primary objective, allowing for a more active piece placement. Propelling the b-pawn forward aims to cramp black's queenside and seize more territory. Relocating the queen to a6 intends to contest the open c-file and prepare a potential foray onto the queenside, though it exposes the queen to further pressure. Shifting the rook to the open file aims to pry open black's queenside defenses by threatening to dominate the file. Seeking respite from the queenside pressure, black repositions the queen to safety, eyeing potential counterplay. Consolidating central space and preparing for potential pawn advances along the queenside. Shifting the knight to the outpost offers centralized pressure, preparing for future advances. Shattering the queenside structure, white opens critical lines and aims to exploit the exposed black king. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines, but abandons the central pawn control, potentially sacrificing development for initiative. Reclaiming the bishop solidifies central control and opens lines for development. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside now creates dynamic imbalances, potentially isolating the white king's defenses. Executing this pawn grab instantly opens lines and pressures black's queenside structure, a daring gamble for material. Exploiting the open file, this pawn push immediately challenges the queen and opens up avenues for tactical skirmishes on the queenside. Opening up the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns. A bold foray by black's queen, seeking activity on the kingside, yet potentially overextending her. Securing the monarch amidst queenside chaos, a prudent move for kingly safety. Shifting queen activity is a bold yet risky maneuver, potentially exposing the monarch. Reinforcing the open file, this secures white's control over the c-file and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece insertions. Challenging white's queenside pawns, this infiltration aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially open new avenues for black's pieces. Securing the queen and preparing to challenge black's advanced pawn structure on the queenside. A bold pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside control and open attacking avenues for the king. This capture finally opens the crucial file for white, threatening further penetration into black's position. Seizing the open file, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and activate the rook, potentially leading to counterplay against the vulnerable king. Sensing an opportunity, white aggressively sacrifices material to seize an open file and threaten the isolated black pawns, aiming for a decisive endgame advantage. Black desperately seeks counterplay by sacrificing a pawn to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines towards the king. Unifying queen and rook, white prepares for a central pawn push and to contest the open file. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal for black's queen and bishop, targeting white's vulnerable king. Sacrificing the queen here to dismantle black's kingside attack is a calculated gamble for white. The rooks are now connected, eyeing central files for aggressive play. Opening the h-file now exposes your king to incoming fire. Initiating a pawn advance on the queen side provides counterplay while the king remains vulnerable to further pressure. Reactivating the rook to eye the kingside and create new attacking avenues. Unveiling a potential kingside defense with the pawn advance, aiming to bolster the monarch's safety. Rook activation to the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on the black queenside pawns. Centralizing the rook on this open file prepares for potential endgame play and strengthens the defense of the f-pawn. Activating the bishop here targets the pawn chain's weakness and prepares for a pawn advance. A pragmatic defensive maneuver, repositioning the king to a safer square, anticipating potential checks on the open diagonal. Repositioning the monarch offers the rook unimpeded access to the 7th rank, preparing for a coordinated assault. Activating the rook on the open file, challenging white's central control and preparing for potential kingside play. A necessary maneuver to dislodge the black king from its central sanctuary and begin consolidating white's advantage. Maneuvering the king towards the center offers better protection and prepares for potential pawn advances. Aggressively staking ground on the kingside, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch. Opening the center with this pawn advance finally breathes life into black's position, aiming to activate the king and potentially create counterplay. Unlocking the d-file offers attacking potential and opens a clear path for the rook. Activating the bishop along the long diagonal creates immediate counterplay against white's exposed king. Activating the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal creates immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure. Unleashing the pawn chain further solidifies the king's safety by creating an escape square. Opening the king's escape route with this pawn thrust signals an aggressive endgame plan. Opening the c-file now releases significant pressure on white's queen, offering a dynamic defensive pivot. Pondering the consequences of this exchange, which simplifies the material and opens a critical pathway for the enemy king's escape. The black king, now exposed and mobile, becomes an active participant in the ensuing endgame, seeking safety and perhaps even counterplay. Unleashing the pawn's final surge towards promotion, this audacious advance forces a decisive confrontation. Opening the central file with this pawn push aims to disrupt white's bishop coordination. Exploiting the passed pawn's advance, white initiates a decisive exchange to simplify into a winning pawn endgame. A desperate king march, hoping to disrupt the rampant pawn advance and perhaps disrupt white's coordination. Promoting the pawn unleashes a decisive queenside advantage, fundamentally altering the endgame's material balance. That bishop sack gambit aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, but it opens a deadly diagonal towards the black king. Exploiting the exposed black monarch, white initiates a decisive exchange to streamline into a winning rook endgame. The black king ventures out, a daring attempt to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Securing the king with a central advance, preparing for endgame activity by clearing the path for the rook. Consolidating the king now offers a crucial tempo, preparing to sweep up pawns and activate its defensive potential. King's centralizing quest begins, aiming to anchor itself and support the pawns.